Why do we believe some ideas but not others? This is obviously a big question, and the answer depends on who you ask, right? But all of us seem to have a standard for what is believable, a kind of threshold that determines whether we think a proposition is true or not. So, if you're watching this, I'm going to make some guesses, right? You probably believe that the brain and body are made of cells, right? Even though you may have never actually seen a cell, I don't know, maybe you have with your own eyes, right? You probably believe that matter is made of atoms and that atoms are made of fundamental particles like protons and neutrons and electrons. You probably believe that the earth goes around the sun, right? That the bright dots you see in the night sky are stars and planets and other kind of things like that, right? You probably believe that the earth is round. Now, in the current times, in the present time, all of these things, all of these facts seem pretty obvious to most of us. And we assume with very good reason that they really are facts that are supported by mountains of evidence. And they truly are. Now, if you're watching this video, if you're watching this channel, right, you probably, maybe not, but probably also believe that biological evolution is a fact, right? Most of the viewers of this channel do seem to be aligned on this point. And indeed, I think most people in general, at least most of a scientific mindset. And my most popular video is about the evolution of the brain. And it has had an overwhelmingly positive response. But after publishing that video a couple years ago, I was kind of surprised to find a considerable number of people, a considerable number of comments that thought I was just spewing pseudoscience propaganda, right? They said things like, "Oh, this is just a fairy tale. There's no real evidence for evolution," or even more bluntly that, well, God created all life in its current form, so evolution can't be right. Now, to their point, I didn't offer much in the way of specific evidence in favor of the theory of evolution. I sort of took that for granted and talked about the evolution of the brain. That's because I truly did not think it was necessary at the time. Just as I don't feel compelled to explain the evidence in favor of kind of, the cellular theory of life every time I talk about neurons, I didn't think it was necessary to do this for evolution. But I realized that many people haven't taken the time to think through the logic and evidence of evolution, and specifically, evolution of the brain, but evolution in general, right? So that's what I'm going to do in this video. That's what this is for. To be honest, I am truly completely open to being wrong, right? If there's compelling counter arguments with evidence that shows evolution to be an illusion, right? I would like to know about it. But to my knowledge, those arguments simply don't exist, right? Everything in biology seems to point toward evolution as a unifying theory, even though particular details of the theory may be incorrect or ill-conceived, right? Now, to do this, I'm going to cover two main topics. First, the logic and theory of evolution. I'll also talk about some caveats and objections. And then I'll describe, secondly, the evidence that shows it to be correct. If evolution is true, then it logically follows that the brain evolved as well, right? Evolutionary theory says that all complex organisms, including humans, have developed through gradual change driven by natural selection, genetic variation over time. Now, the brain, of course, is a critical organ, right? And so like all other organs, it evolved. So while I'll occasionally mention specific findings related to brain evolution, I'm going to focus on evolution more broadly because I think, like I said, it logically follows that the brain evolved. So before I get into all of this, I want to mention a few books that would be really great for enhancing your understanding of evolution. Now, the first book ever written about evolution by natural selection was, of course, this one. You can't have to open it up. On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, right? That was published in 1859. Another one that was really important for me and learning about evolution years ago when I first started really getting into this was The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. Now, that title is, I think, deliberately provocative. It is not about selfishness per se. It's about genes and how they replicate themselves and how that can help us explain evolution. Now, another one, which really deals more with the evolutionary origins of life, is called The Vital Question by Nick Lane. And a fourth one that is a really good read. It's a little bit less technical than the previous three and a little bit more interesting. It's getting a little old now, but it's called Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin. I'll talk about some of his work later. But it explores the evolution of kind of the human body from our fish ancestors, and especially talking about a transitional species known as Tiktaalik, which I will talk about a little bit later. Now, okay, I realize that you probably already have a pretty long reading list and limited time. So I want to suggest a super useful service that I recently started using myself, and it's called Shortform. So it's just honestly pretty amazing. On Shortform, you can get the key concepts from a huge range of books, including all the four I just mentioned: On the Origin of Species, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, The Vital Question by Nick Lane, and Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin. And I'll just show you this here, kind of what it looks like. So if you're watching this, you can see this is kind of what Shortform looks like. It's super cool. They have these one-page summaries. I'll show you, for example, if my internet allows. Yeah, so you can see I was looking at The Vital Question, but they've got these really cool like one-page summaries. They also have full book guides. So they're in-depth summaries of the whole book. It's not just basic summaries of some of the ideas. Like, they really go into the key ideas, talking about these things. And what's, I think, most interesting about Shortform is these, I can't even get to the end of that, but these exercises they have where you answer these questions to sort of test your understanding of the key ideas in the book. So it's really cool. It's a very cool service. Now, to be clear, Shortform is not a sponsor of this video, but I have recently started partnering with them as an affiliate. So that just means that you can get if you use my affiliate link, which you can find in the description, you can get a free trial plus 20% discount on their annual subscription. So go to shortform.com/senseofmind or check out that link below this video if you're interested. I do highly recommend it. But okay, moving on, right? Let's talk about the logic and the theory of evolution. Okay, so most of these discussions begin with Charles Darwin, right? With the On the Origin of Species. So Darwin was this a brilliant 19th century naturalist who co-discovered the primary mechanism of evolution, which we know as natural selection. So I'm not a historian. I'm not a Darwin scholar. I'm not going to focus on his life or how he came up with this theory. But I'm going to, of course, be drawing heavily on his theory, on his work, as well as that of many, many, many biologists and evolutionary scientists who have followed in his footsteps since the publication of The Origin. So you can find a list of sources that I used for this video. In addition, so they'll be in the description of this video. I'll make sure to tack that onto this video. And you can also check out those books I mentioned. If you want to check out Shortform, go ahead. But let's begin. So I want to do a thought experiment. All right, so bear with me. Imagine you are a simple organism, like a single cell bacterium. So as a bacterium, right, let's say that you survive by taking in carbohydrates and other nutrients from the surrounding environment that allow you to power your biochemical machinery. Now, let's say you happen to be, for the sake of this example, living inside the gut of a human and that your main food source is carbohydrate molecules derived from the insoluble fiber of the vegetables that the human eats. So just as an aside, this is an example of a symbiotic relationship between humans and microorganisms. And there are, in fact, billions, if not more, such bacteria in your body, collectively referred to as the microbiome, which you've probably heard of. Now, in order to get access to those carbohydrates, you have to chemically release them from the fibrous structures that bind them together in the vegetable material, right? Now, to cause that to happen, let's say that you secrete an enzyme that breaks the bonds between the carbohydrate molecules in, say, a piece of lettuce, right? This allows you to shuttle those freed up carbohydrates into your tiny cellular body where they can be broken down and used as energy. Now, of course, like all living things, you reproduce, right? You're a bacteria, so you reproduce. And in fact, you do this roughly every 30 minutes. And that's a pretty typical replication time for a bacterium. Now, unlike multicellular organisms, you don't reproduce by having sex, having that gestation period, but instead by just splitting yourself in two, sort of the most basic form of reproduction you can think of. To do that, you have to first make a copy of your DNA, right? So that both of the new bacteria have their own genomes, right? So you have to copy that DNA. Now that process is complex, but it involves basically unzipping the two halves of the DNA double helix, right? And then assembling an exact copy of each strand base pair by base pair. So like if you've heard of A, T, C, G on the DNA, those are bases, so you have to replicate that on each side of it. Now, I'm going to sort of zoom through these details because they're not all that important, but what is important is that DNA replication can and often does make mistakes. Many of these mistakes can be corrected by still more complicated molecular processes. Yet some of them still slip by. So for example, when you're replicating the DNA sequence, it's easy to accidentally attach the incorrect base. So this can result in a tiny change to the overall DNA sequence. There are mechanisms that sort of fix those errors, but sometimes they slip by. And this is called a point mutation, since it's just a change to a single base in the DNA molecule. But in general, any change to DNA, whether it's caused through DNA replication or other events, is called a mutation. So other types of mutation have been identified, like gene duplication, which can occur during DNA replication as well. And so gene duplication is when an entire stretch of DNA that's coding for a protein is accidentally duplicated, which creates a second identical gene. And in fact, it's thought that natural selection has often acted on these duplicated genes. So we'll talk more about natural selection in a moment. But this may have been, for example, may result in the greater number of segments in certain insect species. But leave that for later. We're focusing on you as the bacterium, right? So most of the time, these mutations, these changes to the DNA don't do anything, or they might cause problems, right? So that's most of the time. So for example, if a mutation occurs on a gene that codes for a protein that's used for, building a component of the cell membrane. If that mutation is minor, the resulting protein might function roughly the same as in the parent bacterium, so nothing really happens. But if the mutation happens in a more significant region of that gene, then it's likely that it could cause the protein to not function at all or function in problematic ways. And this could lead to, a leaky cell membrane, let's say, and quickly leads to the death of that bacterium. And, it is no more, right? In some cases, though, mutations can be beneficial. A beneficial mutation is less likely, much less likely, but it does happen. It happens fairly often. For example, let's say that the mutation occurs on a gene coding for digestive enzymes, the digestive enzyme that breaks down the cellulose that we were talking about earlier. In this case, let's say that the mutation happens to cause the enzyme to be just a little bit more efficient, a little bit faster at breaking down those carbohydrate bonds. just a little bit. In this case, the new bacterium, right, would actually benefit from that mutation because it would make it easier to access those carbohydrates that it needs to survive. With millions of other bacteria competing for the same food resource, this bacterium would have an advantage. Thus, it would be more likely than its competitors to survive and therefore to reproduce. Over time, something interesting would happen. The descendants of this fortunate bacterium would gradually become a greater share of the overall population of bacteria. They would come to dominate that population, or at least increase their share in that population. And remember, these bacteria reproduce about once every 30 minutes, right? So it wouldn't take very long for this change in the population to occur. Maybe just a few days, it would be possible a dramatic shift in the population could occur, even with such a minor mutation. So what I've just described is a hypothetical example of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin called this process descent with modification, where descent refers to reproduction and modification refers to variation in the offspring. Now, Darwin didn't know about DNA or mutations, but we now know that mutations, genetic variation in general, provide the raw material upon which evolution acts. Now, it's called natural selection because it's a blind, natural process that effectively selects certain variations that allow the offspring to survive and reproduce more efficiently than their predecessors. That's what we saw with the bacterium, right? Of course, this is a hypothetical example, but I focused on this because these simple organisms make the theory, make the idea, the mechanism clear and easy to grasp. But evolution is not confined to bacteria. Every single living thing on Earth has similar DNA replication processes. Some are more complicated than others, but these occur during reproduction. So all of these processes, all of DNA in every organism is subject to a possibility of mutation. This means that the raw material needed for natural selection to occur is present in every single organism, including you. Right now, as we'll get to, of course, your whole body is made of cells. Those are called somatic cells, meaning cells of the body. But you also have germline cells, right? You have the sperm or egg cells, and those are really where this matters most when we're talking about multicellular species, complex organisms like ourselves, because the mutation has to be passed down through those germline cells. Now, we'll get this will become more clear as we go along, so I'm not going to get bogged down by that. But I also focused on bacteria because they have such a fast reproductive cycle, right? 30 minutes in our example. Humans, right, we take a lot longer to reproduce. At the bare minimum, a female human can have a baby when she's around, maybe 12 years old at the very earliest, or whenever that happens. But it takes a whole 9 months before that baby is born. So this is a much longer reproductive cycle. So it's harder to picture evolution happening in human populations, but estimates, fossil records, we'll get to this later, suggest that our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for roughly 100 to 200,000 years, possibly more. And of course, we had ancestors before that. We'll get to that, I promise. So it does happen, right? Because we're talking about very long stretches of time. Now, as a simple example, scientists, let's talk about some human evolution that really has occurred that we can show in real time. I'll get to more evidence below, but as a simple example, right? It's been observed that people from areas and cultures that historically raised cattle tend to not be lactose intolerant, right? They're able to digest milk and other dairy products on average. Now, while people from cultures that didn't raise cattle historically tend to be lactose intolerant, they can't digest lactose as adults. Now, this is the result of a simple genetic change. When we're babies, all of us have an enzyme called lactase, which allows us to digest lactose, which is the sugar that's found in both breast milk and cow's milk. All right. As we get older, our cells stop producing this enzyme because we're no longer breastfeeding, and therefore our cells don't need to waste valuable resources producing it. The lactase gene, this enzyme, gets permanently shut off, except for those of us who aren't lactose intolerant. Those of us who can digest milk, it doesn't get broken down, or it doesn't get shut off, rather. Our cells just keep producing the enzyme throughout adulthood. But why is that? So historically, in those cultures that raised cattle, those rare individuals whose genomes happened to keep producing the enzyme throughout their lives were able to take advantage of a food source, milk, cow's milk specifically, that wasn't available to the rest of the population. Now, just like that bacteria with its more efficient enzyme, those humans who could drink milk and extract energy from it had a survival advantage, and they were therefore more likely to reproduce. Of course, this only happened in populations that actually raised cattle, which explains why a large proportion of the population is currently still lactose intolerant. Now, this is an average, right? It's not an ironclad rule, but if you look at the distribution of cultures and populations that are lactose tolerant or lactose intolerant, it aligns with this evolutionary story very well. Okay, now we're going to get to the evidence in a bit, but I need to mention caveats and objections to evolutionary theory. So first, I keep using the word theory, right, which leads a lot of people, many people, to think that evolution is not really a fact, but more of like a hypothesis, a guess, an estimate. But in the physical sciences, including biology, theory is a technical term that means the idea is no longer a mere hypothesis. It's not waiting to be proven or disproven. It could always be disproven, right? But it has accumulated so much evidence in its favor that it's never been disproven by any contrary evidence. So it can be considered a factual explanation of physical phenomena. That's why I earlier referred to the cellular theory of life, right? We can just take a microscope, look at any patch of tissue on you and see, okay, yes, you're made of cells. That is a fact, right? But it's referred to as the cellular theory of life because this is what theory means in this technical scientific sense. So theory is roughly equivalent to fact. Now, excuse me. The next thing I need to mention is that there are ways of mutations occurring other than just mistakes during DNA replication. That's the most common way. But for example, radioactive material, cosmic rays, these can cause mutations in DNA in germline cells that can be passed down to offspring. Now, additionally, I'll talk about this more later, but some viruses can get into our cells and insert their own genetic material into our DNA sequence. And this can result in a permanent change that may cause changes to offspring. So this is the case, for example, with the human immunodeficiency virus, the HIV, which causes AIDS, right? It actually gets into cells, into white blood cells, and it can be passed to offspring, not through germline cells, but through breast milk after birth or the bloodstream before birth in the womb. So this will become important later, but another caveat here is that not all variation is the result of genetic mutations. So you may have noticed that while you resemble your parents, right, you aren't identical to either of them. And you're not identical to your siblings, right? Unless you happen to have an identical twin. But even then, there are minor differences, although that's a different story. So when it comes to your parents or your siblings, you might be taller or smarter or have different colored eyes or hair or different physical features in general. And this is largely because you don't have the same genome as them. So you don't have the same genome as either of your parents or your siblings, unless you have an identical twin, like I said. But so it's also possible for selection, for natural selection, to act on these kinds of genetic differences as well. It doesn't have to be specifically mutations. It's a little bit different, but the picture here is that we're talking about genetic variation. Now, a third caveat is that some evolution skeptics and young Earth creationists, right, argue that what I've described here above is merely microevolution rather than macroevolution. So this story about humans becoming lactose tolerant or the bacterium being a little bit more efficient at breaking down vegetables, that's microevolution. They say that evolution within a single species occurs, but it's not a change from one species to another. They say that that's a myth, right? This macroevolution doesn't occur. But the problem with this line of thinking, the fundamental issue, is that macroevolution is just the accumulation of eons of microevolution. So minor changes add up and eventually become obvious, leading to the variety of life that we see on Earth today. So the evolution of one species into another is called speciation, and we will see that there is ample evidence that this kind of change happens in the fossil record and elsewhere. But one thing to mention here is that speciation becomes more likely when two populations of the same species are geographically separated from each other. Talk more about that later as well. But for example, if two populations of a land-dwelling species gradually become separated by the formation of a river or maybe a mountain, they may eventually evolve such that they can no longer reproduce with each other, and they might look very radically different over time. Okay, so I'm moving through these caveats because I want to get to the evidence soon. But a fourth caveat here has to do with another objection, right? This time it's the idea that despite any fossil or genetic evidence or anything else that I might offer, we have never observed one species evolving into a completely different species. It's not perhaps completely true, but let's take it for granted, right? That is, we've never directly seen the evolution of reptiles into birds. So how could we possibly say that evolution is the cause of the variety of life? Okay, so first of all, evolution began as a hypothesis for explaining why there are so many different life forms. So it makes specific predictions about what we should see in the fossil record, in DNA, and even in our own bodies, if it is true. For example, predicts that we should never see a fossil of a mammal, of like a wolf, right? Let's say in the Triassic period in the fossil record, we should never see something like that, because that was the period before animals evolved, or when they were just beginning to evolve. So if that kind of fossil were found, it would throw our whole understanding of evolution into question. Now, this is just one example of the kinds of predictions made by evolutionary theory. Another is that we should see transitional species in the fossil record. For example, there's the 2004 discovery of the fossilized skeleton of Tiktaalik, right? That's actually what the picture on the front of Neil Schubin's book is, because he was one of the scientists who discovered it. And this, as you can see, it has the skeleton shows that it had features of both fish and land-dwelling tetrapods. So these are some of this in general is some of the predictions made by evolutionary theory. And again, it has never been falsified by any serious evidence. So the reason that we don't see these transitions occurring in real time is that they typically take at least tens of thousands of years, if not longer, right? So this relates to another objection, that if humans evolved from, a chimp-like ancestor, then why don't we see chimpanzees constantly transforming into humans, right? Like evolution before our eyes. Why don't we see this? So again, this question to me does reveal a lack of understanding of evolutionary theory. The first point to make is that evolution happens gradually, as I've been mentioning. And secondly, chimpanzees are not our ancestors. They are kind of a distant cousin, according to genetic evidence that we'll discuss later. And finally, there is not some force, right, that inevitably pushes species to develop into humans, or any other species for that matter. That's a misunderstanding. Evolution is a result of environmental pressures that lead to biological adaptations to those pressures, which results in the species we see around us today. So in other words, chimpanzees and humans and every other species is adapted to its particular niche. And we've all been evolving for the exact same amount of time. We're not more evolved than chimpanzees or turtles or anything else you can think of. We all came from a common ancestor. We've all been evolving for the same amount of time. So this leads to another point. Most people who think evolution is false are young Earth creationists. They tend to be fundamentalists who believe in a religious doctrine that humans and all other creatures were created by God in a single event, 6,000 years ago. The problem with this belief is that it is based on little more than faith in that doctrine. There really is no good reason to think that the account of the Earth's creation given in the Bible is accurate. There's so many issues with that. I'll talk about that at the end. But this doesn't mean that you can't be a Christian or that you can't believe in God and still believe in evolution. I've met many Christians in my life who do believe in evolution, right? And so these are not fully incompatible, right? So all it means is that if you do believe in God, it makes way more sense to believe that he used evolution as the mechanism for creating and modifying life on Earth. I'll go as far as to say is that you might even believe that God acts through divine intervention to introduce specific mutations and variations that led to the evolution of humans. Right? What's unbelievable, what can't be believed, is the act of creation, as explained in the Bible, as being a better explanation for the variety of life that we see compared to evolutionary theory. And again, going back to what I said earlier, we could be wrong about aspects of evolutionary theory, and we probably are, and we'll discover that in the future. But as a general framework, it is a much better explanation, a more parsimonious explanation than saying that everything was created in a single event 6,000 years ago. I'll talk more about that later. Now, the last thing I'll mention before moving on to the evidence for evolution is that there are mechanisms by which evolution can occur other than natural selection. So Darwin identified one of these, which is known as sexual selection. It's kind of a variant of natural selection, but it's worth mentioning. So it occurs when members of a species have a certain preference in their mates, right, that has a genetic underpinning, but it might not have a direct link to survival. So for example, peacocks, right, we all know about peacocks, have these huge, beautiful, and almost ridiculous tails, right? Like what are those for? It doesn't seem that they offer them any significant survival advantage, but peahens, females, are more attracted to mating with peacocks that have bigger tails. So this is an example of sexual selection acting because over time, larger and larger tails become more prevalent in that population. So another mechanism is genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution that refers to random changes in the frequency of alleles. These are variants of a gene in a population. So unlike natural selection, which is driven by the survival and reproductive success of organisms with advantageous traits, genetic drift occurs due to random sampling effects, especially in small populations. So an interesting example of genetic drift in humans has been observed in the Amish population in the United States. So the Amish community was established by a small number of founders, I believe from Switzerland, I believe, who migrated from Europe in the 18th century. So this population was small and very reproductively isolated. So certain genetic traits, especially something called Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder that causes dwarfism and other symptoms such as extra fingers, became more common in the Amish population than in the general population. And we can see that reflected in genomic studies as well. Okay, so that's one example of genetic drift. It's not really a natural selection effect, but it is a mechanism of evolution. Now, we've already seen that some evidence that supports the theory, but that is not enough, right? We need to examine the major categories of evidence that have emerged to support evolution. Okay. So there are four main categories that we'll talk about in some detail. So this will be the fossil record, direct observations, biogeography, and genetics. And together, these really form a robust foundation for evolution. I'll also talk about some objections and some refutations of those objections. So let's begin with fossils. So the fossil record provides a kind of chronological record of life on Earth. It shows how species changed over time. And this is especially clear, at least it is, equally clear in the case of human evolution. So there have been many transitional fossils that have been found that document sort of the gradual change from pre-human apes to early hominins to modern Homo sapiens. And as a rule, in general, fossils of evolutionarily older species are found in older layers of rock, right? And I'll talk about some examples. I'll get back to the human evolution, but this is a common, this is important to talk about how do we actually know the age of these rocks and therefore the age of the fossils that are embedded in them. So this is determined using various methods, especially radiometric dating. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on how that works so you can kind of wrap your head around how do we know how old these rocks are, right? If the naked eye, one rock looks, especially if you're not a geologist, one rock looks the same as another, right? So radiometric dating involves radioactive decay. So it involves measuring the decay of radioactive isotopes of elements like carbon-14, potassium-40, uranium-238, and others, right? And so basically it's like the radioactive isotope decays at a constant rate, which is known as its half-life. And this gives us a way of dating fossils, or dating really the rocks surrounding fossils. And we can actually date individual fossils that are up to about 50,000 years old using carbon dating because carbon is a molecule of life and so on. But let me talk about how radiometric dating works to get into a little more detail. So when a rock forms, right, it contains a certain amount of a parent radioactive isotope. So over time, this isotope decays into a daughter isotope. So it's like these isotopes have an extra neutron basically, and it's kicking out that neutron. You can think of it that way. And the ratio of daughter isotopes is used to calculate the age of the rock. So if we know the half-life of the isotope and we can measure how many parent and daughter isotopes are present, we can determine how long the decay process has been occurring. So if you start with 100 grams of a parent isotope that has a half-life of 1,000 years, after the 1,000 years, you'd have 50 grams of the parent isotope and 50 grams of the daughter isotope. So this is a way of dating, of using this very stable feature of these radioactive isotopes, this decay rate, this half-life, to see how long has this been since this rock was formed. And this gets into a lot of detail that I'm not going to go into here, how this actually works. How do we know how many of the parent isotopes are present in a rock when it's formed? There's complicated methods to get there. So I'm not going to get bogged down in that, but I wanted to give that as like an overview of how radiometric dating works. Now, the kind of less high-tech method of looking at the fossil record is known as stratigraphy, right? And this is the technique of looking at kind of the layers of rock, the strata in which fossils are found. So basically the idea here is that lower layers of rock, layers deeper in the earth, are older than higher layers. So this allows us to estimate the relative age of fossils, and that assumption, that idea, that hypothesis has been confirmed using radiometric dating. Right? We can see that if you're in the Grand Canyon, the deeper you go, the older those rocks are compared to the ones higher up. This has to do with how sedimentary rocks form from the accumulation of sediments like sand and silt and clay, which are laid down by water or wind or ice. And over time, these sediments are buried and compacted into rock. And because the new layers are deposited on top of older layers, the deeper layers are older. So this is observable in natural settings like riverbeds and ocean floors, and it's consistent across various geological formations. So, okay, I know that was a lot of technical jargon. So let's just talk about some of the examples of evolution, of human evolution specifically, that have used these methods to determine how old are these fossils. So I'll talk about three different fossils, three different species of actually pre-hominids and then members of the genus Homo. So first is Australopithecus afarensis. Now this is one of the most famous fossils that's been discovered. It was called Lucy when it was discovered. It's a partial skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis. So this was discovered in 1974, and using the methods I mentioned, it is estimated that Lucy, this skeleton, lived about 3.2 million years ago, and she shows a mix of human-like and ape-like features, which indicates a transitional form between early apes and early humans, early hominids. So her pelvis and leg bones suggest that she walked upright, which was a key step in human evolution, this bipedalism. So that was very significant. And the radiometric dating techniques I just talked about were used to confirm the age of this fossil. A second one you may have heard of is Homo habilis, and this kind of means handyman. They're known as handyman because we believe that they used stone tools. So Homo habilis fossils date back to around 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago. And their brain size was larger than the Australopithecus. So their skull, their cranial volume was larger than Australopithecus, which seems to show a significant step toward the modern human brain, toward modern humans. I'll show a picture in just a second of these skulls of these fossils because it's interesting to just look at, okay, there really is a progression there. Now, they also discovered tools alongside these fossils, which indicates cognitive development, right? You have to be smart enough to be using these tools and developing a simple form of technology. So again, they were dated using radiometric methods and the context of the strata in which they were found. And finally, Homo erectus. These are fossils of that were discovered originally in Kenya and seem to reveal a species that lived about 1.9 million years to 110,000 years ago. Their estimates vary. So Homo erectus and Homo habilis are of the genus Homo, so they're considered kind of hominids, pre-modern humans, but anatomically pretty different enough that they are different species, right? But Homo erectus had a larger brain and body size compared to those earlier hominids and is believed to be the first to use fire and complex tools. So again, some of these specifics are not set in stone, right? But they are the skeletons are really what tell the story. So I'll just show that picture that I mentioned because it's just interesting to look at. So it's on Wikipedia. But anyway, you'll see the progression from Australopithecus. Skull looks much more ape-like, and then moving to Homo habilis, right? Looking much more like a human, although you can see significant differences. Then you get to Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. So you can see this progression through the fossils, right? Now, of course, there are objections to this, right? There are gaps in the fossil record. And I should mention, this is just humans, and it's just tiny sampling of what's available in the fossil record. I don't have time to go into every, certainly not every example of evolution that we can infer from the fossil record, but this is just an example of some of the evidence that you can see. Now, there is often this objection that there are gaps in the fossil record, the missing links, so to speak. But the problem, there's a fundamental issue with that objection, and it is that there's no, evolution is a smooth progression, right? So we're always going to find gaps in the fossil record. It's never going to be, and especially when you think about how fossils form, right? This is a process that's not that likely to occur. So you're going to have missing pieces to this picture. But over time, more and more have been discovered, and more and more complete picture has been formed, and we can infer that transition. Now, this is not alone why we believe that evolution is the right theory for life, right? For the variation of life, for the progression. There are also direct observations of evolution occurring in more or less natural settings, right? So let me just talk about a couple of these. So these, I think, provide really compelling evidence for the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. And one is, these are, I'm veering away from humans, but talking first about bacteria. So you may have heard about antibiotic resistance in the news. There's this MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, I think, bacteria that are resistant to our usual methods of treating bacterial infections, right? Antibiotics. How does that happen, right? How does it happen so quickly that we develop this medicine, these antibiotics that effectively kill bacteria, and yet over time we see more and more bacteria that are not being killed by these antibiotics. Now, that is an example of natural selection because, of course, there's variation in these bacteria. Some can survive antibiotic treatment, right? And they pass on those resistant genes, just like the bacteria we saw earlier with the enzyme. And this can lead to populations of increasingly large populations of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And of course, this is well documented and observed in clinical settings worldwide. I wish I had the video. I couldn't find it, but there's one, I think it's from Harvard. I saw it years ago, where they just had an experimental setup where they started with bacteria that were not resistant to a certain antibiotic, and placed them kind of on a it was on a table or something like that, where there's a line of antibiotic where they can't grow past that line because they're killed by it. But it's over, I think, over in the course of only a few days, maybe a few weeks, where eventually natural selection starts happening, and the bacteria do cross that antibiotic line. They're able to grow past it because of the processes we're talking about here. So there's experimental evidence for this. And then a well-known example of kind of evolution in action, direct observation, is the peppered moths, which, so during the Industrial Revolution in England, there were these moths, these peppered moths that were originally lighter colored. They were kind of like white, basically. And as there were more pollution in the air from industrial processes, it would cause the tree trunks of where these moths landed, right, to become darker, right? Soot caused these darkened tree trunks. And so that made it so that birds could more easily pick those white, they could see the white peppered moths on these trees that were originally lighter colored. And so that was an example. And then over time, what they saw was these peppered moths got darker and darker and darker. Why? Because we're talking about natural selection of variation that was present in this population, and these birds were acting as a selection pressure, along with, of course, the pollution from the industrial processes. And then when the pollution levels decreased, lighter colored moths once again became more common. So this provides a clear example of the evidence of natural selection in action, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the objections to this tend to be, this is microevolution, not macroevolution. I talked about the issue with that line of thinking. So I'll just move past that, because another example is, or another line of evidence is biogeography. So biogeography is the study of the distribution of species across geographic areas. And this provides evidence of how species evolved in isolation and adapted to their environments. So biogeography explores these intricate patterns of species distribution across geographic regions, especially, I'll get to that in a sec, but it offers insights into how evolution occurred in the past. So basically, it investigates the spatial arrangement of species and examining the factors that influence their presence or absence in those specific localities. So one of the central key points to understand about biogeography is this concept of isolation. So isolation can between, like what I was mentioning earlier, two groups of the same species, right? It can occur due to geographic barriers like the formation of a mountain range or ocean or a river or habitat fragmentation or all kinds of things that can geographically separate these species such that they're isolated. So now these isolated populations are cut off from that main gene pool, they're cut off from each other, and they can experience unique selective pressures and environmental conditions. And over time, those populations accumulate genetic differences that lead to the formation of new species. So the best known example of this, the classic example, comes from, of course, Darwin on the Origin of Species, this book again, where the finches of the Galapagos Islands, which were studied by Charles Darwin, he documented how each island of the Galapagos had finches with different beak shapes and sizes that were adapted to their specific diets and the conditions on those islands. And he originally thought they were different species, but eventually came to the conclusion that they had come from a common ancestor through adaptive radiation, through this process I was just talking about. And this kind of shows how natural selection occurs in these separated, isolated environments. And in fact, there have been other studies of these same finches in more recent times by, I believe, the Rosemary and someone Grant, the Grants. They studied these populations for years, for decades, and showed directly observing further evolution of these same finches that Darwin had studied 100 years, 200 years earlier, or no, 100 years earlier. So there are other examples of this kind of thing happening. Marsupials on the Australian, in Australia, like why are marsupials so common there and not typical placental mammals like everywhere else? Seems to be because of this kind of isolation, these biogeography type processes. Now, again, objections. Some argue that biogeographic patterns could result from specific individual separate creation events, right? Okay, so created one species here, another species there. On the Galapagos, we had one species of finch created and then another, right? But the consistent patterns of the species distribution align with with evolution, with the predictions of evolutionary theory and genetic data. So that's what I'm going to talk about next is genetics. But this really provides a coherent explanation, a scientifically robust and parsimonious explanation. Okay, so genetics. Genetics is the fourth major category of evidence for evolution. And this has really revolutionized our understanding of evolution. This has allowed scientists to trace the lineage of species and look at our genetic relatedness and see that the changes that have driven evolution at the genetic level. Excuse me. So how does this work, right? The first concept to understand is just comparative genomics. This is relatively simple. So, we have the human genome. We also have the sequence of many other species genomes, and we can look at similarities and differences in those DNA sequences that reveal or at least support the idea of evolutionary relationships. So for example, humans, we share approximately 98 to 99% of our DNA with chimps, chimpanzees, and bonobos, right? These are our closest living relatives. We're part of the great ape family with them. And this genetic similarity aligns with the idea of a common ancestor, right? I'm going to talk about some other studies that have suggested that as well. But studies have pinpointed specific genes and regulatory elements, sequences on DNA that have evolved differently in our species compared to chimps and bonobos, which contribute to our species-specific traits. right? And so in general, comparative genomics allows scientists to construct phylogenetic trees, basically the tree of life, right? The evolutionary relationships among these species. A second important concept of how genetics helps us understand evolution is the idea of a molecular clock. This is separate from the idea of circadian rhythms. This is a different thing. So this is a method that uses can measure the rate of genetic mutations to estimate the time the time of divergence between species. So to be clear, right, to be honest, this rate can change depending on the gene and the species in question. But by analyzing the number of genetic differences between species, scientists can get estimates of when they last shared a common ancestor. So this has been used to estimate the divergence between humans and chimpanzees. And I've cited a 2016 study that used this method to conclude that the human lineage and the chimpanzee lineage may have split about 6.5 to 9.3 million years ago. They say, quote, this is in broad agreement with evidence from the fossil record, which suggests a chimpanzee split time of 6 to 10 million years ago. So again, we're like using multiple lines of evidence to converge on this same result. Oh, the fossils seem to show we had a common ancestor with chimpanzees sometime around 6 to 10 million years ago. Oh, and so does this genetic evidence. Okay, this is really looking robust, right? Okay, another concept here that's important to understand is something I kind of mentioned earlier with HIV, these endogenous retroviruses. So that's ERV for short. So these are viral sequences that they're DNA sequences from viruses that are embedded in the genomes of many species. So these can serve as kind of genetic fossils in a sense that trace back to ancient infections in common ancestors. So there are examples of identical ERVs present in the genomes of humans and chimpanzees. And this is another indication that we share a common ancestor, because it is very unlikely that both of these species were infected by the same virus independently. It's much more likely that a common ancestor was infected with this one virus and then passed it down through that lineage to both chimpanzees and humans. Now, how do these viruses get into our genome in the first place? Well, they infect cells. One mechanism is that these viruses get into our cells and they literally insert their genome they insert a stretch of themselves in their genetic material into human DNA. And that's what HIV does. But this can happen to germline cells, which can result in basically the past infection by a retrovirus like this in these germline cells, these reproductive cells that can be then passed down to offspring like a regular gene. And many of these don't have any effect on health anymore, or they may be latent and could be sort of reawakened. But the point is that the presence of the same ERVs in the genomes of humans and other primates indicates a shared evolutionary history. Now, another mechanism that can be used to transfer these ERVs is what I mentioned earlier, which is horizontal transmission. So rather than germline cells being infected, when it comes to a virus like HIV, it is transferred through the bloodstream, or through breast milk when it comes to the mother transferring it to her offspring, right? So anyway, this is all just examples of genetic evidence in favor of the idea of common ancestry. So some people argue that genetic similarities could be attributed to a common designer, right? An intelligent designer, rather than common descent, as I'm suggesting. But the detailed patterns of genetic mutations and these shared sequences and the presence of these endogenous retroviruses are really best explained most parsimoniously, most simply by evolutionary processes, right? They fit the predictions of genetic inheritance and natural selection over millions of years. Okay, so those are the four major categories of evidence, right? And I'm not a geologist, I'm not a geneticist, I am not a biogeographer or a biologist, although I have like a degree in biology, but this is me like reading the literature and trying to explain what the evidence is, right? And to me, all of this shows great support for evolutionary theory, right? And there's still others, like there's still other categories of evidence that maybe are less direct or less, however you want to look at it. But one of these is comparative anatomy, right? You could see the structural similarities in the bodies and brains of animals and see, okay, it does look like we're descended from a common ancestor, like when it comes to mammals and when it comes to humans, cats, whales, bats. We all have this same basic pattern in our forelimbs, right? We have one bone, I'm forgetting the name of the bone right now, but we have one bone in our upper arm, two bones in our forearm, and then blobs of bones in our wrists, like little pieces of bone, and then five digits, right? And that's a common common feature of all of our forelimbs, right? From really different, seemingly very different animals, right? Cats, whales, humans, bats, any mammal you can think of, really. And actually going back further than mammals, that's much about what Your Inner Fish is about. He talks a lot about how you can even go back to reptiles and amphibians and see some of this. So another category of evidence is less conclusive. It's more suggestive. It is embryonic development. So during early stages of embryonic development, vertebrates, such as ourselves, we exhibit similar structures. We look almost identical to, like, a human embryo in the very early stages looks almost identical to a fish embryo, to a bird, to other mammals, of course. And these structures that look the same early on develop into different structures. So one of these is something called the pharyngeal arches. And in fish, these develop into gills, while in humans, they form parts of our ear and throat. Now, of course, this is not conclusive evidence by itself, but it raises an interesting, important question. So if evolution is not the right explanation for the variety of life, right, why would an embryo not just resemble a tiny human that gets bigger and bigger? That's what they used to think before embryology was a real science. They used to think, oh, well, it's just a tiny human that then grows bigger and bigger and bigger, right? But that's not what happens. We look like almost the same as other vertebrates in those very early stages, and then gradually change into more and more like a person, a human. So anyway, that's one category. Now the final, and I think this was what really struck me when I read On the Origin of Species, when I was first really starting to study biology. I thought, like, why is this not more? Why didn't I not think about this before? But it's maybe the most intuitive evidence that shows that the general mechanism of natural selection, and this is artificial selection, selective breeding. So we have known for millennia, right, that you can transform an animal through selective breeding. So artificial selection, this acts much faster than evolution. It's a much faster mechanism for evolution than natural selection, because it involves this process of deliberate selective breeding that's accomplished by a human rather than the slow natural process of blind evolution. But nevertheless, it allows us to see that given the right selection pressures, an animal or plant, for that matter, can be radically transformed. So for example, dogs, right? All dogs, from Chihuahuas to Pit Bulls to Great Pyrenees, right? Very different looking creatures, are descended from a single ancestor, which is probably the gray wolf or a wolf-like creature. And current estimates Some place the domestication of dogs between about 11,000 and 33,000 years ago. But interestingly, wolves and dogs and even coyotes can mate with each other and produce viable offspring. So they have not really quite evolved to the point of technically being separate species, but they have a common ancestor. And there are these interesting phylogenetic trees that show the evolutionary relationship not only of dogs and wolves, but all the breeds of dogs. I saw this today, and that you can find that article. It's Friedman and Wayne 2017, published in journal Annual Reviews. And then when it comes to plants, right, humans have been using artificial selection to create more and more abundant crops, and more productive crops. And we've even begun to directly genetically engineer these crops to create bigger yields and more, for example, pest-resistant plants. And of course, messing with the genome in this way could have secondary effects and unexpected negative downsides. But the point is that artificial selection and selective breeding prove that animals and plants can be transformed by descent with modification. There are many other examples, of course, of artificial selection. All kinds of domestication are artificial selection, but I'm not going to go into that because it's already over an hour, and I'm going to now sort of bring this all together, okay? So I think that the evidence for evolution is robust. It is multifaceted. It spans a huge range of things: fossil records, direct observations, biogeography, genetics, artificial selection, all the things we've talked about here. And each category provides a different lens, a different line of evidence where we can understand the processes that have shaped life on Earth, and they converge on similar answers and give us this picture. Now, these diverse findings really point to this evolutionary explanation for the diversity of life. But okay, before I move on, I want to dispel one final misconception about evolution. Throughout this video, I have pushed back against young Earth creationist arguments against evolution. The Earth was not created 6,000 years ago, but closer to 3.5 billion years ago. That estimate might change, but it certainly won't go all the way down to 6,000 years. Life emerged, right, and it changed gradually over that time period. And it resulted in what Darwin called endless forms most beautiful. We see this around us all around us today, the evidence for evolution. And evolutionary theory explains the variety, the anatomy, the genetics, the distribution, the fossil record of life on Earth far better, far more parsimoniously, more simply than saying that God created all living creatures in their current form several thousand years ago. I know this is going to anger some people. I've already accomplished that with my other videos on evolution, but I have to take this argument head on because it's a bit frustrating. So sometimes young Earth creationists will argue that, in fact, it is us, it is the biologists, the evolutionists who are dogmatic. So there's this guy, Ken Ham, you may have heard of. He's a Christian fundamentalist, and he's founder of an organization called Answers in Genesis. He had a debate with Bill Nye years ago about evolution. It's check that out. It's a good debate. I think Bill Nye did a great job. But he wrote in a Twitter post, an X post, I guess, what you call it. But he wrote, quote, "For those who believe all life arose by evolutionary processes over millions of years, their worldview built on this causes them to look at the evidence of the present to interpret it within the evolutionary history they believe." So, as I stated, right, evolution began as a hypothesis about, this is me talking now, not Ken Ham. Evolution began as a hypothesis about how life emerged and how the biosphere came to be what it is today. Ever since then, evidence that we've talked a little bit about, but not even scratched the surface on, has accumulated in favor of evolution. It's not that we blindly interpret evidence within the evolutionary framework. Instead, we're trying to explain the world around us. And evolution seems to be the best, most comprehensive, simplest, most parsimonious explanation that anyone has ever come up with. To believe that everything was created in a single act 6,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago forces you to come up with all kinds of assumptions. You have to disregard or explain away the fossil record by saying that a global flood caused the rapid burial and fossilization of countless organisms, which is inconsistent with the observed stratification and dating methods that indicate a much longer and more gradual process. You have to ignore and reinterpret the extensive genetic evidence that supports common ancestry and the gradual accumulation of mutations over time, which is very well documented through comparative genomics. You have to also challenge the consistency of radiometric dating techniques, which reliably date rocks and fossils to millions of years. This requires assuming that decay rates of radioactive elements have drastically changed in the past, and there's just really no credible scientific evidence for that. So going back to Ken Ham, right, he argues that we evolutionists are engaging in a form of confirmation bias. We're searching for evidence to confirm our preconceived notions while disregarding contrary evidence. But let me just read a quote from an article written by a guy named Bodhi Hodge and published on Ken Ham's website, answersingenesis.org. This is supposed to show how biology, this article that he wrote is supposed to show how biology supports the Bible's account of creation. And so if you go to the website and you click on the biology section, it's actually the first article listed. He says, quote, "If we refuse to accept the biblical statements, then we give up the foundation of our belief system. The non-Christian doesn't want us to use the Bible, but wants us to reject it and accept his belief system. They accept biological evidence," in quotes, "as their supreme authority," end quote. Okay, from that passage, who is really engaging in confirmation bias here? Hodge, this author, seems to go further. He suggests that any ideas about history that are not specifically aligned with the Bible should not really be trusted. He writes, quote, "Why would we want to give up our starting point and accept theirs? It should be the other way around. They need to give up their reliance on man-made ideas about the past and instead use the Bible," with an exclamation mark. End quote. All right, I'm ranting here, but it really is deeply frustrating when creationists, when people of this sort of belief system call me arrogant or dogmatic or suggest that I'm just blindly engaging in confirmation bias. These statements that I just read show the hypocrisy of those accusations. Now, again, I want to come back to something I said earlier. I don't want this argument against young earth creationism to be taken as an argument for, against all religion or against the existence of God. I personally do not believe in God. I'm not religious, but that doesn't mean that I think all religious people are stupid or irrational or anything like that. If God does exist, evolution would seem to be a particularly elegant, if rather brutal, mechanism with which to populate the earth with living organisms. It is an elegant, parsimonious explanation, right? And it's true, many Christians and other religious individuals believe exactly that. They've been convinced by the evidence and the logic of evolution while retaining their faith. And to me, that adherence to rationality is admirable, and it forms the centerpiece of scientific inquiry. So again, I just don't want this to be taken as an attack on religion or on faith in general. I'm specifically looking at young earth creationism. And so the more that all of us, right, religious and non-religious alike, can embrace rationality as our means of understanding the universe, the less conflict we will have and the more progress we will make in creating a better world for every single one of us. So Anyway, I hope that you have gotten something out of this video. I have no doubt that there are going to be a slew of comments telling me how stupid I am for even bringing this up and how evolution is such a myth and all of that. But I really appreciate all of you watching this, checking this out. This episode began as a Patreon only live stream. So patrons had access to the live stream and then became public later. So if you're watching this later and you want to get access to these live streams as well as exclusive videos and blog posts, written versions of every single video, go to patreon.com/senseofmind and sign up. Check out the different tiers that you can sign up for. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to look at those in-depth book summaries and check out shortform.com/senseofmind, the link for that is in the description. You can get that 20% discount on the annual subscription as well as a free trial. So check it out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you. And I'll catch you next time.